Blood on linoleum smells exactly like loose change and panic. That was the first conscious thought Josephine had when the man with a bullet lodged in his ribs crashed through her front door. The squall outside was currently drowning out the city sirens, but the real disaster was bleeding all over her cheap entryway rug. He wasn't a prince in disguise, and she wasn't anyone's savior. He was a violent man from a violent world. She caught babies for a living. But tonight, she was going to have to catch him. The rain didn't fall. It threw itself against the single-pane glass of Josephine's apartment like a beggar demanding to be let in. It was a miserable, bruised purple kind of Tuesday night. The power had flickered out 20 minutes ago, leaving the apartment smelling of dust, extinguished pilot lights, and the cheap wax of the 2 emergency candles she had struck and jammed onto saucers. Josephine, Joe to the mothers she coached through 20-hour labors, Ms. Mercer to the clinic billing department, was exhausted. It was a marrow-deep fatigue. Her scrubs were stiff with dried, amniotic fluid at the hems. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that timed itself perfectly with her pulse. She was sitting on the edge of her sagging sofa, staring at a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, trying to summon the momentum to unlace her sneakers. Then came the noise. It wasn't a knock. A knock implies manners. It was a heavy, wet thud against the cheap particle board door, followed by a scraping sound, like a sack of wet sand sliding down the wood. Joe froze. The neighborhood was rough, the kind of place where you ignored screams if they didn't involve your own name, but trouble rarely came up to the 4th floor. Another thud. Weaker this time. She stood up. Her joints popped in the quiet room. She didn't grab a weapon. A kitchen knife against whoever was out there was a joke. She moved to the door, pressing her bare palm against the cool, painted wood. "Who's there?" she asked. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, harsher. "I'm calling the cops." A wet, rattling exhale came through the gap under the door. "Do that," a voice rasped. It sounded like gravel grinding together. "And I'll bleed to death before they find the right building." Jo closed her eyes. The cynical, exhausted part of her brain, the part that had seen 3 teenage mothers that week alone, told her to walk away. Let the hallway deal with it. Let the janitor find him in the morning. But her hands were already unlocking the deadbolt. The chain slid back with a metallic clatter. She pulled the door open. He didn't step inside. He spilled in. Jo scrambled back as a mass of soaking wet wool, leather, and heavy bone collapsed onto her entryway floor. He landed hard on his side, his breath hitching in a sharp, involuntary hiss. "Hey!" Jo snapped, the shock overriding her fear. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey, look at me." He was massive. Not the gym-sculpted vanity kind of big, but dense. Functional. His black wool coat was saturated with rainwater, and his dark hair was plastered to a pale, sharp-angled face. His eyes were squeezed shut. But it was the smell that hit her first. Ozone from the storm, the wet dog scent of soaked wool, and the sharp, unmistakable, metallic stench of fresh blood. He was clutching his left side. Blood, thick, dark, and arterial, was seeping between his white-knuckled fingers, pooling onto the linoleum, mixing with the muddy rainwater from his boots. He cracked an eye open. Dark brown, glassy with pain, but entirely lucid. He looked at her, tracking the movement of her hands. "You a nurse?" He grunted, his voice tight. "Midwife," Jo said, her hands moving instinctively. She grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat. "Let go of your side. I need to see." He barked out a laugh that ended in a wet cough. "A midwife. Perfect. Push, breathe, right? Let go of your side." Jo repeated, her voice dropping into the flat, authoritative tone she used when a delivery went wrong. It worked. His hand relaxed, falling away to reveal a ruined dress shirt beneath the coat. Joe pulled the fabric back. The fabric tore with a sickening wet sound. The entry wound was just below his floating rib. It was ugly, puckered, dark, and steadily weeping blood. "Did it go through?" she asked, her mind already calculating. Towels, boiling water, the lidocaine she had in her trauma kit. "Felt it hit the brick wall behind me," he rasped, his head falling back against her floorboards. "Yeah, it went through." "Don't move," Joe commanded. She stood up, her sneakers slipping slightly in the slick mixture of blood and water on the floor. She needed light. She needed supplies. As she turned toward the bathroom, a cold, heavy sensation gripped her ankle. She looked down. His hand, slick with his own blood, was wrapped around her leg. The grip was terrifyingly strong for a man who had lost half his blood volume. "No cops," he said. The glassy look in his eyes receded, replaced by something cold, sharp, and intensely violent. "No ambulances. You fix this or you let me rot right here, understand?" Joe looked down at him. She saw the bulge of a holster beneath his left arm. She saw the expensive cut of the ruined clothes. She knew exactly what kind of man bled out in fourth-floor apartments on Tuesday nights. "I don't care if you rot," Joe said, her voice completely deadpan. "But you're not doing it on my floor. Let go of my leg." He stared at her for a long second. Then slowly, his fingers uncurled. Dragging a man who weighed over 200 pounds into the kitchen was an exercise in ugly, ungraceful mechanics. Joe hooked her arms under his armpits, her forearms pressing into his soaked chest, and pulled. He tried to use his boots to push, but his legs kept failing. By the time she got him propped up against the cheap Formica cabinets under the kitchen window, they were both panting, and a thick red smear tracked across the floor like a gruesome snail trail. "Up," she grunted, hauling his torso. "Jesus," he hissed through gritted teeth, his head lolling against the cabinet door. "You got terrible bedside manner." "You're not in a bed," Joe replied, kicking a stool out of the way. She had brought out the 2 emergency candles and set them on the counter. In the flickering yellow light, the kitchen looked like a slaughterhouse. Joe dropped her trauma bag onto the linoleum. She had stolen the bag from the clinic over the course of 3 years. Gauze, surgical scissors, betadine, a few precious vials of lidocaine, and suture kits. She had taken it for the uninsured mothers who sometimes needed off-the-books aftercare. Not for mobsters. She knelt beside him, the knees of her scrubs soaking up his blood. She took her trauma shears and cut his shirt from the hem to the collar. It fell open, revealing a chest covered in fading bruises and a few old, silvery scars. "Name," Joe said, uncapping a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the bottle in her hand. "I need your name to keep you anchored," she said flatly. "If you pass out, I need to know what to yell to wake you up. Otherwise, I might just leave you here." His jaw worked. "Roman. Okay, Roman, this is going to suck." Joe didn't wait for him to brace himself. She poured the rubbing alcohol directly into the wound. Roman didn't scream. He didn't even yell. His back arched off the cabinets, his boots scraping frantically against the floor, and a low, guttural animal noise tore out of his throat. His right hand shot out, grabbing Joe's wrist with a crushing force. Her bones ground together. Pain flared up her arm. "Let go," she said quietly, looking directly into his eyes. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead and mixing with the rain. He stared at her, his pupils blown wide. He was looking at her, but he was seeing whatever alley or warehouse he had just crawled out of. "Roman," Joe said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cadence she used to calm feral panic. "Look at the candles. Look at my face. You are in a kitchen. You are safe. Let go of my wrist so I can fix this." He blinked. The fog in his eyes parted. He looked at his hand wrapped around her arm, realizing what he was doing. He let go instantly, his hand dropping to the floor. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jo ignored the apology. She didn't want him humanized. She wanted him patched and gone. She took a gauze pad, soaked it in betadine, and began cleaning the edges of the entry wound. "Bullet went clean through," Jo said, leaning over him to check his back. "Exit wound is messy, torn muscle. It missed the lung, or you'd be blowing pink bubbles. You got lucky." "Feels lucky," he groaned, his head tilting back. Jo prepped the syringe. "Lidocaine. It'll numb the surface, but you're still going to feel the pressure when I stitch." She injected the local anesthetic in a circle around the jagged edges of the tear. Roman watched her hands. He noticed the dried blood on her scrub pants, the bags under her eyes, the complete lack of trembling in her fingers. She worked with the detached efficiency of a mechanic changing a tire. "You do this often?" he asked, his voice tightening as the needle pierced his skin. "Stitch up gunshot wounds?" "No," Jo said, threading a curved needle with black nylon suture. "Stitch up perineums that have been torn to shreds? Every week. Tissue is tissue." A weak smirk ghosted across his lips. "Comparing me to a—" "Don't laugh," Jo warned, pressing a sterile pad against his side. "You'll pull the muscle. Take a deep breath." He inhaled. She drove the needle through the thick skin of his side. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds in the apartment were the rain hammering the glass, Roman's ragged, hissing breaths, and the wet snick of the suture thread pulling tight. Jo was entirely in her element. The exhaustion that had weighed her down earlier was gone, burned away by adrenaline and professional focus. She was so close to him she could smell the expensive, spicy cologne lingering beneath the blood and sweat. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He was violently shivering now. Shock setting in. "Almost done," she murmured, tying off a knot with swift, precise movements of her fingers. Snip. "That's the front. Lean forward." Roman obeyed, his forehead resting against her shoulder as she reached around to stitch the exit wound on his back. His hair brushed against her neck. He was heavy, his body heat seeping through her thin scrubs. For a second, just a fraction of a second, Jo felt a bizarre, totally inappropriate surge of awareness. He wasn't just a patient. He was a man. A very dangerous, very alive man, currently leaning his entire weight onto her. She clamped down on the thought, punishing herself by tying the next knot a little too tight. Roman flinched. "Easy. Don't get shot," Jo replied. She finished the back, taped thick gauze pads over both sides, and wrapped his torso tight with an ace bandage, pulling it taut to maintain pressure. "There," Jo said, sitting back on her heels. She wiped the sweat off her own forehead with the back of her wrist. "You're closed up. If it gets infected, you're dead. If you tear the stitches, you bleed out." Roman slowly lifted his head from her shoulder. He looked down at the neat, tight bandaging. Then he looked at Jo. The candlelight cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw and the deep fatigue in her eyes. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't a throwaway courtesy. It carried weight. Jo stood up, picking up her blood-soaked shears and the empty lidocaine vial. "Don't thank me. Just figure out how you're going to get off my floor before my landlord comes for the rent on Friday." The storm blew itself out somewhere around 4 a.m., leaving behind a sky the color of dirty dishwater and a profound, ringing silence. Jo hadn't slept. She had dragged Roman from the kitchen to her pull-out sofa. a process that involved a lot of swearing on her part and a few stifled groans on his. Once he was horizontal, he had passed out almost immediately, his body shutting down to hoard its remaining resources. Jo spent the rest of the night scrubbing. She was on her hands and knees with a bucket of cold water, a splash of bleach, and an old toothbrush, working the blood out of the baseboards. The metallic smell was gone, replaced by the sharp, chemical burn of chlorine. Her hands were raw, and the ache in her back had evolved into a sharp, stabbing pain. She stood up, cracking her neck, and looked over at the sofa. Roman was asleep. Without the heavy coat and the blood, he looked different. Younger, maybe. He was undeniably striking in a rough, unpolished way. A strong, straight nose, a sharp jaw peppered with dark stubble, and thick lashes resting against pale cheeks. But even in sleep, there was a tension to him. His hands weren't relaxed, they were curled into loose fists by his sides. Jo walked into the tiny galley kitchen and turned on the tap. The power had come back on an hour ago. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, listening to the rising hiss of the water. She leaned against the counter, holding a mug, staring at the wall. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a cold, creeping paranoia. Who was he running from? Who had shot him? Were they looking for him? A shift in the fabric of the sofa made her turn around. Roman was awake. His dark eyes were open, fixed entirely on her. He didn't look disoriented. There was no groggy blinking or confused looking around. He simply woke up, immediately assessed his surroundings, and locked onto the only other person in the room. Jo didn't flinch. She took a sip of her coffee. "You're alive." Roman slowly pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing as the pulled muscles in his side protested. He swung his legs over the edge of the sofa, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He looked down at his bare chest, at the crisp white bandages wrapping his ribs. "Looks like it," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He cleared his throat. "Water." Jo walked over, handed him a glass of water from the sink, and stepped back immediately, keeping her distance. Roman took the glass, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was warm. The fever hadn't set in. He drank the water in 3 long gulps and set the glass on her cheap coffee table. He looked around the apartment. He took in the peeling wallpaper, the stack of medical textbooks on the floor, the ancient, humming refrigerator, and finally, Jo herself. She was wearing a different set of scrubs, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, a defensive scowl etched into her features. "I made a mess of your place," Roman said. "I cleaned it." Jo replied coldly. "Most of it. The rug is ruined." Roman reached into the pocket of his discarded trousers, which were draped over a dining chair. He pulled out a thick, silver money clip, holding a stack of $100 bills that looked thicker than Jo's entire monthly salary. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. "For the rug, and the medical supplies." Jo stared at the money. It was insulting. It was a lifeline. It was dirty. "I don't want your money," Jo said, her voice shaking slightly. She hated that it shook. "I want you to leave. The rain stopped. You can walk. Get out." Roman didn't move. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, ignoring the pull on his stitches. He looked at her, really looked at her, parsing the contradictions. She lived in a dump, but she refused thousands of dollars. She was terrified of him, but she had stitched him up with the steady hands of a surgeon. "Do you know who I am?" Roman asked softly. The question wasn't arrogant, it was genuine. "I know you carry a gun, you pay in cash, and you bleed just like everybody else," Jo said, crossing her arms over her chest. "That's all I need to know. The door is right there." Roman stared at her for a long moment. A heavy, suffocating tension filled the small room. It wasn't the tension of violence. It was something else. A strange, quiet recognition. Slowly, Roman stood up. He swayed slightly, bracing a hand against the wall. He picked up his ruined shirt and his heavy coat. He didn't pick up the money. He walked toward the door, his boots heavy on the clean floorboards. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. He didn't look back at her. "The money stays, Josephine," he said quietly. Jo froze. "I never told you my name." Roman turned his head, just enough for her to see the hard line of his profile. "I saw your mail on the table. You saved my life, Josephine. I don't leave debts unpaid." He opened the door and stepped out into the damp, echoing hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jo alone in the quiet apartment, staring at the stack of blood money on her table, realizing with a cold certainty that this wasn't over. The clinic smelled of industrial floor wax, fear, and the stale powdered milk they kept in the break room. For 3 days following the storm, Josephine buried herself in that smell. It was her armor. She delivered a breech baby on Thursday to a terrified 19-year-old girl who screamed until her capillaries burst around her eyes. She spent Friday arguing with apathetic insurance adjusters over the phone, her voice grinding into a dull, mechanical monotone. She worked until her feet swelled against the canvas of her sneakers, and her brain felt like it was packed with wet cotton. She did it deliberately. Exhaustion was the only thing that kept the memory of the bleeding man in the black coat from crawling behind her eyes every time she blinked. But the money was still there. It sat exactly where Roman had dropped it, resting on a cheap, scarred coffee table. A thick, insulting brick of $100 bills bound by a silver clip. It felt radioactive. Jo hadn't touched it. She drank her morning coffee staring at it. She ate her instant noodles glaring at it. It was a physical manifestation of a world she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. A world of violence, quick fixes, and consequences that came knocking in the middle of the night. On Saturday evening, the illusion of her normal life completely fractured. Jo trudged up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, keys dangling from her exhausted fingers. She paused on the 3rd-floor landing to catch her breath, leaning against the peeling, sea-foam green paint of the wall. The hallway usually smelled of boiled cabbage and damp dog. Today, it smelled faintly of bleach and pine. She reached her door and froze. The cheap, fraying welcome mat was gone. In its place was a thick, dark grey runner. But that wasn't what made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The door to her apartment was closed, the deadbolt locked, but a small white envelope was wedged into the door jamb. Jo snatched it, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and threw the deadbolt behind her with a sharp, metallic clack. She stood in her cramped entryway, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. The money was still on the table. She tore the envelope open. There was no letterhead, no signature, just 2 lines of text written in a sharp, slanted scrawl with black ink. Your landlord has been compensated for the remainder of your lease. The locks on your windows have been replaced. Jo dropped the paper like it was on fire. She spun around, looking at the window above her fire escape. The rusty, broken latch she had ignored for 2 years was gone. In its place was a heavy, brushed steel locking mechanism. It was newly installed, the screws gleaming in the dim apartment light. A cold, suffocating wave of violation washed over her. He had been inside, or his people had been inside. They had moved through her space, touched her things, assessed her vulnerabilities, and quietly patched them up. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was an assertion of control. It was a predator circling its prey and deciding to build a fence to keep other predators out. Joe's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with a sudden blinding rage. She survived in this city by being invisible. She kept her head down, she paid her rent late, but paid it, and she owed nothing to anyone. Roman had stripped that away in a single afternoon. She grabbed her coat. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in the apartment. It didn't belong to her anymore. She marched down the stairs, her boots hammering against the concrete. She pushed through the heavy front doors of her building and stepped out into the humid, exhaust-choked evening air. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. "Going somewhere, Josephine?" The voice came from the mouth of the alley adjacent to her building. It was that same gravel and ash rasp, smooth but carrying an undeniable weight. Joe stopped dead. She turned her head. Roman was leaning against the brick wall, half hidden in the gloom. He was wearing a dark suit today, tailored perfectly to accommodate the heavy bandage she knew was strapped to his ribs. A lit cigarette dangled between his fingers, the cherry glowing fiercely in the twilight. The scent of rich, expensive tobacco cut through the city smog. "You broke into my home?" Joe said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, cold and hard as river stones. Roman pushed off the wall, stepping out of the shadows. He moved slower than before, a subtle stiffness in his torso betraying the wound, but he still carried himself with an apex predator's grace. "I secured your home," he corrected, stopping a few feet from her. His dark eyes flicked over her face, taking in the anger, the tension in her jaw. That fire escape latch was a joke. Anyone could have jimmied it with a butter knife. "It's none of your business," Joe snapped, taking a step toward him. The rage was overriding her common sense. "You don't get to touch my things. You don't get to pay my rent. I don't want your protection, Roman. You have it anyway," he said flatly. He took a drag of his cigarette, the smoke curling around his sharp jaw. "You saved my life. In my world, that puts a target on your back. If the people who put that bullet in me find out a civilian patched me up, they won't hesitate to use you to get to me." "Then stay away from me!" Joe shouted, the sound echoing down the empty street. "If you stay away, they won't know." Roman looked at her, his expression unreadable. He dropped the cigarette to the wet pavement and crushed it beneath the heel of his leather shoe. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of tobacco, rain, and that dark, spicy cologne wrapped around her. Joe held her ground, refusing to step back, though her pulse was frantic in her throat. "It's too late for that," Roman murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. He looked down at her, his eyes tracking the nervous flutter of her pulse at the base of her neck. "I already know you're there, Josephine. You're not invisible anymore." He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The air between them was so thick with tension it felt combustible. Joe stared up into his dark, assessing eyes, and realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that he wasn't just talking about his enemies. He was talking about himself. "Take the money back," she whispered fiercely. "No." Roman turned away, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. A sleek, black town car pulled out from a side street, its headlights cutting through the gloom, and idled smoothly at the curb beside them. The rear door popped open. Roman paused, looking over his shoulder. "Lock your new windows, Josephine. The city is getting worse." He folded himself into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a heavy, expensive thud, and the car glided away into the traffic, leaving Joe standing alone on the sidewalk, breathing hard, entirely consumed by a terrifying mixture of anger and a dark, electric curiosity. The summons came 4 days later, exactly at midnight. Joe was standing at her kitchen sink, aggressively scrubbing a scorched frying pan, when a sharp, authoritative knock rattled her door. It wasn't the desperate, bloody thud from last week. It was 3 sharp, rhythmic raps. Professional, patient. She turned off the tap. The water dripping from the faucet sounded deafening. She walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw a man in a dark overcoat standing in the hallway. He looked like an accountant who had decided to take up competitive weightlifting. Jo didn't open the door. She spoke through the wood. "Go away." "Ms. Mercer," the man said. His tone was polite, bored even. "Mr. Costa requested your presence. It's a medical emergency." Jo closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the door. "Take him to a hospital." "We can't do that, Ma'am. He was very specific. He needs you." The memory of Roman's dark, bleeding torso flashed in her mind. Her hands tightened into fists. "I am not his personal physician. I'm a midwife. Tell him to find a back-alley surgeon." "Ma'am," the man said, a slight edge of urgency finally creeping into his voice. "It's not for him. It's for a girl. She's bleeding heavily. She's pregnant." Jo's eyes snapped open. The cynicism that usually shielded her vanished instantly, replaced by the hard, cold calculation of her profession. A pregnant woman, bleeding, outside a hospital setting. The math on that was universally deadly. She threw the deadbolt and ripped the door open. The man stepped back in surprise. Jo had her trauma bag slung over her shoulder before he could even process her movement. "Drive," she ordered. The ride was a blur of neon streetlights and silence. The man didn't speak, and Jo didn't ask questions. She mentally catalogued her supplies. Pitocin, tranexamic acid, clamps, gauze. If it was an abruption, there was nothing she could do without an operating room. If it was a hemorrhage, she had exactly minutes to stop it. The car pulled up to the back of a dormant brick warehouse near the docks. The air smelled of salt, rotting kelp, and industrial rust. 2 large men flanked a heavy steel door. They parted instantly as Jo and her escort approached. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous void of shadows and dust, save for a makeshift office constructed of frosted glass partitions in the center. The glow of overhead fluorescent lights spilled from the enclosure. Jo pushed through the glass door, ignoring the men standing around the perimeter. The room smelled overwhelmingly of iron, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Roman was standing by a metal desk, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked haggard, a dark bruise forming along his jawline, but his eyes were sharp. On a leather sofa against the wall lay a girl. She couldn't have been older than 20. Her blonde hair was matted with sweat, her face the color of chalk. A dark, widening stain soaked the crotch of her sweatpants, dripping rhythmically onto the concrete floor. "Out!" Jo barked, dropping her bag onto a rolling chair. Roman turned, his relief almost palpable for a fraction of a second before the hard mask slammed back into place. "Josephine! I said get out!" Jo snapped, not looking at him. She dropped to her knees beside the sofa, ripping open the sterile packaging of a pair of latex gloves. "All of you, outside the glass, now." The men in the room looked at Roman, waiting for an order. Roman stared at the back of Jo's head. Her hands were already moving with frantic, practiced efficiency, checking the girl's pulse, assessing the blood loss. "Do what she says," Roman commanded quietly. The men filed out. Roman lingered for a second longer, watching the rigid line of Jo's spine. Then he stepped out, pulling the glass door shut behind him. Jo tuned out the heavy, watchful silhouettes pressing against the frosted glass. She focused entirely on the girl. "Hey," Jo said softly, her voice shifting into the warm, anchoring tone she reserved strictly for her patients. "What's your name, honey?"
"It's Sylvia,"
the girl stuttered, her teeth chattering violently. Shock. "Okay, Sylvia. I'm Joe. I'm going to take care of you. How far along are you?" 12 weeks. She sobbed, clutching her stomach. "Am I losing it? Please, I can't lose it." Joe's heart sank, a heavy stone dropping into her stomach. 12 weeks. The volume of blood on the floor told the rest of the story. It wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. "Sylvia, I need to check you," Joe said, her hands moving gently to strip away the soaked clothing. "Squeeze my hand if it hurts. My hand if—" It was a miscarriage. A brutal, incomplete one. The tissue hadn't fully cleared, and the cervix was caught open, causing a massive hemorrhage. The girl's blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Joe's hands worked blindly, entirely on muscle memory and instinct. She administered an injection of medication directly into the girl's thigh to force the uterus to contract, trying to clamp down the bleeding vessels. "Breathe with me, Sylvia. In through your nose, out through your mouth." The next 30 minutes were a bloody, horrific battle in the center of a mobster's warehouse. Joe fought the hemorrhage with every trick she knew, manually clearing the tissue, packing gauze, massaging the abdomen until her own forearms ached and burned. Sylvia cried until she had no voice left, her fingers digging crescent moons into the back of Joe's hand. Joe absorbed the pain, speaking in a low, continuous murmur, anchoring the girl to the living world while her body tried to tear itself apart. Finally, the bleeding slowed. The uterine muscle clamped down into a firm, rigid ball under Joe's palm. The crisis broke. Joe sat back on her heels, her chest heaving. Her scrubs were ruined. Her hands beneath the torn latex gloves were slick with blood. The metallic smell in the small office was suffocating. Sylvia was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, a thick wool blanket tucked up to her chin. Joe stood up slowly, her knees popping. She stripped off the gloves, throwing them into a bloody pile on the floor. She walked to the small sink in the corner of the office, turned on the cold water, and aggressively scrubbed her hands with industrial soap. The glass door opened behind her. Roman stepped in. He looked at the blood on the floor, at the sleeping girl, and finally at Joe. She was leaning over the sink, gripping the porcelain edges so hard her knuckles were white, trying to control the fine tremor shaking her shoulders. "Is she—" Roman started, his voice unusually hesitant. "She's alive," Joe said, turning off the tap. She didn't turn around. "She lost the pregnancy. She lost a lot of blood. If I had been 10 minutes later, you would be rolling her up in a rug." Roman fell silent. The heavy, oppressive quiet of the warehouse rushed back in. Joe finally turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollowed out. The clinical detachment was gone, leaving behind a raw, scraping anger. "Who is she to you?" Joe demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the sofa. "A runner? A girlfriend? Collateral damage?" Roman's jaw tightened. "She's my sister." Joe froze. The anger in her chest hit a brick wall. She looked from Roman's hard, unforgiving face to the soft, pale features of the sleeping girl. There was a resemblance, a sharp curve of the cheekbone, the stubborn line of the brow. "She got pregnant by a man who works for a rival family," Roman said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, though the muscle jumping in his cheek betrayed him. "They found out tonight. They beat him to death in an alley. They dragged her out of her apartment to make her watch. That's what triggered the bleeding." Joe stared at him, horror slowly replacing the adrenaline in her veins. She realized then that the dark bruising on his jaw wasn't from a random fight. He had gone in to get her back. "You couldn't take her to a hospital," Joe whispered, the pieces falling into place. "Because they would be watching the ERs. If they find her, they'll finish the job," Roman said. He stepped closer, the harsh overhead light catching the exhaustion in his dark eyes. He looked down at Jo, looking past the blood on her clothes, past the defensive anger. "I didn't bring you here to play games, Josephine. I brought you here because you're the only person I trust to keep her alive." The words hung in the air, heavy and irretractable. Trust. It was a dangerous word coming from a man like him. Jo looked down at her hands. They were clean, but they still felt stained. She was in too deep now. She had crossed the invisible line that separated her quiet, grey world from his violent, neon one. And God help her, as she looked up into Roman's intense, searching eyes, she realized a terrifying truth. She didn't want to step back. The warehouse was a tomb, and tombs were no place for the living. Jo made that clear before the blood on the concrete floor had even begun to dry. Sylvia needed a sterile environment, intravenous fluids, and a bed that did not smell overwhelmingly of diesel fuel, damp rot, and iron. Roman didn't argue. He made a single phone call, his voice a low, vibrating murmur against the frosted glass partition. 10 minutes later, they were moving. The safe house was a high-rise condominium located on the extreme edge of the city's financial district. It smelled like fresh paint, ozone from the heavy-duty central air conditioning, and absolute nothingness. There were no personal touches, no framed photographs, no books on the shelves, just expensive, heavy, dark leather furniture sitting on top of cold, polished concrete floors. It was a space designed purely for hiding, stripped of any humanity. Jo spent the first 3 hours turning the cavernous guest bedroom into a makeshift medical ward. She stripped the stiff, high thread count sheets from the mattress, replacing them with a waterproof surgical barrier she had aggressively demanded Roman's men procure from an all-night pharmacy across town. She administered oral antibiotics to Sylvia, checking the girl's temperature every 30 minutes, listening intently to the heavy, dragging, exhausted sound of her breathing in the quiet room. By 4 in the morning, the violent crisis had fully settled into a dull, manageable ache. Sylvia was asleep, her pale face illuminated entirely by the harsh amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Jo walked out of the bedroom, leaving the heavy oak door cracked open just enough to hear any sudden movements. The condominium was dark, save for the cool, icy blue glow of the city skyline bleeding through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. Roman was sitting at the massive granite kitchen island. He had finally taken off his suit jacket and the leather shoulder holster. The holster sat heavily on the counter, an ugly piece of black steel and worn leather resting next to a crystal glass filled with a dark amber liquid. He was staring blindly at the glass, his large hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles completely white. Jo walked to the stainless steel sink and began washing her hands. She turned the water on, scalding hot. She let the water burn her skin, welcoming the sharp, immediate, grounding physical sensation. She scrubbed the industrial soap under her fingernails, washing away the phantom sensation of blood. "She is stable," Jo said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty room. She did not turn around to look at him. "Her fever hasn't spiked. The bleeding is minimal now. She is going to hurt intensely for a few days, mostly heavy cramping and muscle fatigue. The emotional part, that is going to take much longer to heal. Thank you." His voice was entirely hollowed out, scraped entirely clean of its usual dangerous, commanding edge. Jo turned off the tap. The sudden silence was deafening. She dried her hands slowly on a thick cotton towel and finally turned to look at him. Without the heavy armor of his tailored suit and the immediate, sharp adrenaline of the medical crisis, Roman looked exactly like a man who was quietly, desperately drowning. The dark bruise on his jaw had bloomed into an ugly, mottled purple and black shadow. He was rubbing his thumb relentlessly over the rim of the crystal glass, the repetitive motion betraying a deep, restless, gnawing anxiety. She walked over to the island and pulled out a tall metal stool across from him. The silence between them wasn't hostile anymore. It was incredibly heavy, saturated completely with the intimate, gruesome reality they had just survived together. "Why didn't you take her completely out of the city?" Jo asked, her voice dropping into a low register. "If the people who did this to her are actively looking for her, they aren't looking for her." Roman interrupted, looking up. His dark eyes caught the blue light of the window, making them look bottomless. "They are looking exclusively for me. She was nothing but bait. They deliberately left her alive in that apartment because they knew without a doubt she would call me, and they knew I would come." "But you got her out," Jo pointed out gently. "I lost 3 men getting her out." Roman lifted the glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. The sharp scent of cheap whiskey and his expensive, spicy cologne drifted across the cold granite counter. 3 men with wives, with children, gone. They died because I didn't see the threat coming. Because I arrogantly let my younger sister date a boy I knew absolutely nothing about. Jo watched him. The deeply cynical part of her brain, the part that kept her alive in the slums and taught her never to trust men with guns, screamed at her to judge him, to see the violent monster he truly was. He was calculating the horrific loss of human life like a bad hand at a poker table. But the emotional part of her, the part that caught tiny babies and held the trembling hands of terrified, dying mothers, saw something entirely different. She saw the crushing, suffocating weight of a man who carried his entire dark world on his shoulders, knowing intimately that every single misstep cost human blood. "You cannot control everything, Roman," she said softly, leaning her arms on the counter. He let out a harsh, abrasive laugh that held absolutely no humor, only sharp gravel. "In my specific line of business, Josephine, if you do not control absolutely everything, you end up on a steel slab. Or worse, the people you love end up on a slab." He leaned forward, bracing his heavy forearms on the counter. The sudden physical proximity was jarring. Jo could clearly see the extremely fine lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes, the dark, rough stubble shadowing the sharp angles of his face. She could hear the subtle, rhythmic, strained intake of his breath against his injured ribs. "I bring absolute ruin to everything I touch," he murmured, his heavy gaze dropping deliberately to her bare hands, which were resting quietly on the cold stone. His fingers twitched, resting just a millimeter away from hers. "You should have walked away from me that rainy night in your apartment. You should have locked the door and let me bleed out on the hallway floor." "I do not let people die on my floor," Jo replied steadily, though her pulse was violently kicking up a frantic, heavy rhythm in her throat. She stubbornly didn't pull her hand back. She stared directly into his dark, exhausted eyes, feeling a terrifying, magnetic, inevitable pull. "And you didn't die." Roman slowly, very carefully, lifted his right hand. He didn't touch her skin. Instead, he slowly traced the exact outline of her knuckles with his index finger, hovering just a tiny fraction of an inch above her skin. The ghost of contact was purely electric. It sent a sharp, involuntary shiver straight down the center of her spine. "No," he whispered, his voice incredibly dark and gravelly. "I didn't, and now you are standing right in the middle of the crossfire." He suddenly dropped his hand. The sudden absence of his radiating warmth left a cold, biting patch of air between them. "Get some sleep, Jo," he instructed quietly, turning his gaze back to his glass. Tomorrow is going to be infinitely worse. Tomorrow was significantly worse, and the long, grueling day after that was a masterclass in pure, unadulterated claustrophobic paranoia. For a continuous 72 hours, the sterile safe house became a literal pressure cooker. The central air conditioning hummed a dull, monotonous tune that felt exactly like a dental drill pressing directly against Joe's temples. Roman's heavily armed men stood guard right outside the steel-reinforced front door, their heavy combat boots occasionally scraping loudly against the hallway tile. The heavy, lingering scent of stale takeout boxes, bitter black coffee, and sharp, sterile medical wipes entirely permeated the expensive, soulless apartment. Sylvia was physically mending, albeit slowly. The severe bleeding had stopped entirely by early Sunday morning, leaving behind a profound, hollow, physical exhaustion that kept her bedridden. She barely spoke a single word. She simply lay curled tightly on her side in the center of the guest bed, staring blankly at the beige wall, caught entirely in the silent, suffocating grip of deep grief. Joe did exactly what she could. She gently forced the traumatized girl to drink warm chicken broth, meticulously changed the bedpans, and sat quietly beside her for hours, offering the silent, steady, anchoring presence she had thoroughly honed over years of grueling clinic work. But the real, tangible danger wasn't inside the quiet bedroom. It was in the living room. Roman relentlessly paced. He was a caged, highly dangerous animal, violently stripped of his sprawling territory and his rigid control. The phones rang constantly. He answered the cheap plastic burner cells in clipped, intensely violent whispers before forcefully snapping them shut and angrily tossing them onto the granite counter, the plastic cracking against the stone. Joe desperately tried to stay completely out of his way, but the large condominium suddenly wasn't big enough. Every single time she walked into the open kitchen for a glass of tap water, he was standing right there. Every time she sat heavily on the leather sofa to rest her aching lower back, she could vividly feel his dark, assessing eyes tracking her every movement. The building tension between them was no longer just an atmosphere. It was a physical entity. It was thick, jagged, and entirely suffocating. It wasn't just raw fear. It was an acute, undeniable, heavy physical awareness that was actively grinding her frayed nerves to pure dust. On Tuesday evening, the immense pressure finally fractured. Joe was standing in the kitchen, aggressively, repeatedly slicing a yellow lemon for Sylvia's hot tea. The sharp blade of the knife hit the wooden cutting board with sharp, violent, rhythmic thuds. She was utterly exhausted. Her neck intensely ached, her blue scrubs were stiff with dried sweat, and she desperately wanted a hot shower that didn't involve keeping one ear constantly open for the sharp, terrifying crack of a gunshot. "Stop pacing!" Joe loudly snapped, the harsh words flying out of her mouth before her exhausted brain could filter them. Roman halted mid-stride, directly behind her. The incredibly heavy silence that immediately followed was totally deafening. Joe completely froze, the sharp knife suspended rigidly right above the wooden cutting board. She slowly, carefully turned around. He was standing exactly 2 feet away. He had discarded his dress shirt hours ago, completely unable to stand the rough friction of the fabric against his healing, stitched wounds. His broad chest was heavily wrapped in stark white medical gauze, a bright contrast to the dark ink and pale, old scars marking his skin. He looked incredibly dangerous. The hollow, beaten exhaustion in his face had been completely replaced by a sharp, lethal predatory focus. "What did you just say?" he asked. His voice was an incredibly soft, deeply deadly murmur. Joe swallowed hard, but the incredibly stubborn, deeply cynical defiance that kept her alive on the city streets violently flared up. She forcefully set the knife down on the counter. "I said stop pacing. You are wearing a literal hole in the floorboards, and you are driving me completely crazy. If you desperately want to go out there and violently kill them, go! But stop trapping us in this endless waiting room." Roman stared intensely at her, a small muscle rapidly feathering in his clenched jaw. Then he deliberately closed the short distance between them in a single, fluid, terrifyingly fast step. Jo loudly gasped as her lower back hit the sharp edge of the granite counter. Roman didn't physically grab her, but he firmly planted his large hands on the counter on either side of her hips, completely trapping her. His intense body heat was a sudden, heavy physical wall pressing heavily against her front. He strongly smelled of dark sweat, sharp adrenaline, and that rich, spicy, expensive cologne. "You honestly think I want to be locked inside this cage?" He rasped, leaning down until his hard face was mere inches from hers. His dark eyes were intensely burning. "I am staying inside this room because the exact second I leave this building, the people hunting me will realize I am unprotected, and then they will easily find this apartment, and they will find you. I didn't actively ask for your protection," Jo fiercely whispered. Her breath hitched. She was totally trapped, but she wasn't scared. That was the truly terrifying part. She vividly felt a hot, reckless, heavy surge of adrenaline pooling deep in her stomach. "I know." Roman heavily breathed. His dark gaze deliberately dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a long, heavy, agonizing second before dragging slowly back up to her wide eyes. "You never ask for anything, do you, Josephine? You just quietly take the bleeding, deeply broken things and stubbornly stitch them back together." "I am a midwife. I deliver life. I do not fix broken monsters." "I am a monster," he quietly agreed. The sudden admission was deeply raw, scraped violently from the very bottom of his soul. He leaned slightly closer. The rough friction of his gauze-wrapped chest gently brushed against her thin scrubs. Jo's breath violently caught in her dry throat. Her hands, entirely of their own accord, came up to slowly rest flat against his hot stomach, just below his white bandages. His hard abdominal muscles instantly locked incredibly tight under her palms. The stark contrast of his extremely hot skin and the freezing cold granite pressing behind her back was absolutely maddening. "Tell me to step back," Roman firmly commanded, his deep voice heavily shaking with the immense physical effort of holding himself in rigid check. He was staring intensely at her lips, his own parting slightly. "Tell me right now that you want to go back to your quiet, lonely, grey life, Josephine. Tell me, and I will physically back away this exact second. I will walk out that front door and leave you entirely alone." Jo slowly looked up at him. She vividly saw the extreme violence in his past and the inevitable destruction in his dark future. She vividly remembered the thick blood on her floor and the dirty money sitting on her table. She saw absolutely every logical, sensible reason to forcefully push him away, but she also intimately felt the desperate, rapid, hammering rhythm of his heart directly beneath her hands. She felt the raw, completely undeniable heavy tether that had instantly snapped tightly into place the stormy night he bled onto her rug. The quiet, extremely safe life she had fought so incredibly hard to build suddenly felt exactly like a suffocating tomb. Jo tightly gripped his hips, her short fingernails aggressively digging into his bare skin, and forcefully pulled him down. It was absolutely not a soft, gentle kiss. It was a violent collision. Roman let out a rough, deep, guttural groan, his hands immediately sliding off the cold counter to tightly grip her waist, forcefully hoisting her up onto the freezing granite. He kissed her exactly like a man who was starving, like a deeply desperate man who knew intimately that the world was violently ending right outside the door, and this was his absolute last meal. His mouth was hard, incredibly demanding, tasting heavily of cheap whiskey, extreme exhaustion, and pure ruin. Joe forcefully kissed him back with entirely equal ferocity. Her hands instantly tangled tightly in his thick, dark hair, actively pulling him even closer, desperately anchoring him to her body. She opened her mouth completely to his, aggressively matching his desperate, heavily bruising rhythm. The harsh, wet sound of their desperate breathing completely filled the quiet, sterile kitchen, sounding exceptionally harsh and ragged. He gently bit her swollen lower lip, not quite enough to draw blood, but more than enough to make her loudly gasp. The soft sound swallowed instantly and completely by his hard mouth. He was actively, systematically destroying the rigid boundaries of her quiet world, brick by heavy brick, and exactly as his rough, calloused hands slid slowly up her rigid spine, leaving a heavy trail of absolute fire in their wake, Jo tightly closed her eyes and willingly let the entire wall fall. The kiss ended as violently as it began. Roman broke away, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wide and unfocused for a fraction of a second. He stumbled backward, his heavy boots scraping loudly against the polished concrete. The sudden absence of his body heat left Jo shivering on the cold granite counter. She touched her swollen mouth. It tasted intensely of copper and whiskey. "I shouldn't have done that," Roman rasped, wiping the back of his hand across his jaw. The raw vulnerability was gone, instantly replaced by a thick, impenetrable armor. "Pack your bag. I am getting you out of here." Jo slipped off the counter. Her legs felt like hollow reeds, but the cynical, pragmatic core of her brain was already rapidly taking over. "You can't move, Sylvia. She is too weak. If she bleeds again in a moving car, she will die." "If she stays here, she dies anyway," Roman countered, picking up his shoulder holster from the island. He checked the magazine of his heavy black pistol with sharp, mechanical clicks. "My men haven't checked in for 20 minutes. The perimeter is compromised." Before Jo could process the absolute finality of his words, the heavy oak door of the safe house violently splintered. It wasn't a subtle break-in. The deafening, concussive roar of a shotgun blast completely shattered the deadbolt. Wood shrapnel exploded into the quiet entryway. Roman moved with terrifying, instantaneous speed. He grabbed Jo by the shoulder of her scrubs and physically hurled her behind the massive granite kitchen island. She hit the floor hard, her knees bruising painfully against the cold concrete. "Stay completely down," he roared over the sudden chaotic din. 3 men in dark tactical gear poured through the ruined doorway. The sterile apartment instantly filled with the sharp, acrid stench of burning gunpowder and the terrifying, rapid staccato of automatic gunfire. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind the living room sofa completely shattered, raining thousands of tiny, diamond-like shards of safety glass onto the leather furniture. Jo curled into a tight, trembling ball beneath the overhang of the granite counter. The noise was absolutely physical. It pounded against her eardrums, rattling her teeth. She covered her head with her hands, squeezing her eyes shut. She vividly smelled the dust from the pulverized drywall, mixing heavily with the dark, copper scent of fresh blood. Roman was returning fire. He stood exposed at the edge of the kitchen, his heavy pistol barking loudly. He dropped the first man with 2 clinical, precise shots to the chest. The second man fired wildly, shredding the wooden cabinets directly above Jo's head. Cheap porcelain plates exploded, showering her back with sharp, biting ceramic dust. "Sylvia!" Jo screamed, her voice completely swallowed by the deafening gunfire. She opened her eyes. Roman was bleeding. A stray bullet had grazed his left bicep, tearing through the muscle. He didn't even flinch. He kept firing, methodically forcing the remaining attackers back toward the ruined doorway. Jo didn't wait for permission. She crawled on her hands and knees, dragging her belly across the glass-strewn floor, moving frantically toward the guest bedroom. A bullet buried itself violently into the drywall, just inches from her face, dusting her eyelashes with white chalk. She kept violently crawling. She kicked the bedroom door open. Sylvia was sitting up in bed, her face completely chalk white, her hands clamped tightly over her ears, screaming a continuous, soundless scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Get up," Jo commanded, her voice harsh and utterly devoid of comfort. There was no time for bedside manner. "Put your shoes on right now. We are leaving." Sylvia rigidly shook her head, paralyzed by fear. Jo grabbed the girl's thin arm and brutally yanked her off the mattress. Sylvia collapsed onto the floor, loudly sobbing. "I cannot walk!" The girl choked out, clutching her stomach. "You will walk, or you will die here," Jo coldly stated. She hauled Sylvia up by the waist, wrapping the girl's arm heavily over her own shoulder. She absorbed half of Sylvia's body weight, her own exhausted muscles screaming in immediate protest. They staggered out of the bedroom just as the heavy gunfire abruptly ceased. The sudden, ringing silence was somehow worse than the deafening noise. It felt thick and heavily expectant. Roman was standing alone in the ruined living room. 3 bodies lay completely motionless in the entryway. The pristine apartment looked like a chaotic war zone. He ejected the empty magazine from his pistol, the hot metal clattering loudly onto the concrete, and seamlessly shoved a fresh one into the grip. He looked at Jo, his chest violently heaving. His dark eyes darted to the heavy blood steadily dripping down his left arm, and then directly to the terrified girl leaning heavily against Jo's side. "The service elevator," Roman ordered, gesturing sharply toward the back of the kitchen. "Go." The descent in the metal service elevator felt like a slow, agonizing drop straight into purgatory. The fluorescent overhead light flickered erratically, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the cramped metal box. The smell of garbage and industrial grease was deeply nauseating. Sylvia leaned heavily against the metal wall, her eyes tightly closed, completely surrendered to the physical pain radiating through her cramped abdomen. Jo stood rigidly beside her, staring blankly at the metal doors. Her hands were violently shaking. The sudden drop in pure adrenaline left her entirely hollowed out, incredibly cold, and deeply nauseous. Roman stood right in front of them, his broad back deliberately blocking their view of the doors. He was a silent, heavily armed wall. The blood from his freshly torn bicep steadily dripped onto the metal floor, matching the exact rhythm of Jo's racing pulse. "We need a new car," Roman murmured, his deep voice heavily strained. "They will be actively watching the garage. There is a clinic van parked in the alley behind my old apartment building," Jo heard herself say. The flat, dead tone of her own voice completely startled her. "I have the keys in my pocket. It is completely unmarked. It smells terribly of bleach and vomit, but it runs." Roman slowly turned his head to look at her. His dark, exhausted eyes searched her pale face. He was deeply looking for the overwhelming panic, the righteous anger, the sudden desperate demand to be let go. He found absolutely nothing but cold, pragmatic resolve. "If you drive that van for me tonight, Josephine, there is no going back," he warned softly. "You become an active accessory. You cross the line entirely. They will unequivocally hunt you just as hard as they hunt me." The elevator abruptly lurched, coming to a harsh, grinding halt at the sub-basement level. The heavy metal doors slowly began to slide open, revealing the dark, cavernous gloom of the concrete parking garage. Jo looked directly at the blood-staining Roman's arm, and then down at her own ruined scrubs, heavily dusted with pulverized drywall and speckled with another man's blood. The quiet, grey, incredibly safe life she had violently clung to was officially dead. It died the exact minute she opened her apartment door to a bleeding stranger on a stormy night. She could furiously deny it, she could run desperately away from it, but the permanent stain was already deeply set in her fabric. She didn't want the quiet life anymore. She wanted the terrifying, electric, heavy truth that stood bleeding right in front of her. Jo reached directly into her deep scrub pocket, her cold fingers firmly wrapping around the heavy metal key ring. She pulled it out. The keys loudly jingled in the damp, quiet garage air. "The van is parked 3 blocks east," Jo stated firmly, stepping deliberately past Roman and out into the dark garage. She didn't look back. "Keep up, Roman. I am not waiting for you." A sharp, ragged sound escaped Roman's throat. It was half a heavy sigh, half a dark, dangerous chuckle. He adjusted his heavy grip on his pistol, slipping smoothly into the deep shadows right behind her. The heavy rain had started again outside, forcefully hammering against the concrete ramp of the garage. It smelled exactly like wet asphalt, cold ozone, and the violent, inevitable promise of a terribly long night. Jo stepped out into the absolute downpour, the freezing water instantly soaking her hair. She firmly held Sylvia's arm, guiding the deeply traumatized girl through the dark, winding alleyways of the sleeping city. Roman walked a few paces behind them, his dark silhouette blending completely into the violent storm. He was a deeply violent man from a deeply violent world, and she was the cynical midwife who had stubbornly decided to catch him. As they finally approached the rusted, dented white van idling silently in the dark alley, Jo pressed the unlock button. She opened the driver's side door, climbing heavily into the cold, ripped vinyl seat. Roman slid silently into the passenger side, his large frame completely dwarfing the small cabin. He looked over at her, the harsh orange glow of the street lamp fully illuminating the fresh blood, the deep bruises, and the dark, absolute possession fiercely burning in his exhausted eyes. Jo put the keys into the ignition. She aggressively turned the cylinder. The engine loudly roared to life, drowning out the heavy rain. She violently threw it into gear and drove completely into the dark. Did you feel the electric pulse of the final escape? Jo finally embraced the dark chaos of Roman's violent world, leaving her quiet life completely behind in the rubble. If you loved this deeply gritty, intensely emotional mafia romance, and want to uncover what happens next as Jo fully enters the criminal underworld, hit that like button right now. Share this raw story with friends who crave real, grounded tension. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below. Did Jo make the right choice, or is she doomed?